Chapter 14, The Road to a Modern State. Zionism and the Jewish National Movement, Basel, Switzerland. August 29, 1897. The old casino building was humming with a nervous electricity. Delegates from across Europe, Praeby's lawyers, journalists, and restless young students sat shoulder to shoulder in stiff chairs, their black coats brushing against one another like crows perched on a wire. Outside, the Rhine shimmered in late summer light, while inside, a dream long whispered in exile found its voice. Theodor Herzl, elegant in his dark beard and neatly pressed frock coat, rose to speak. His eyes, heavy with sleepless nights and the burden of centuries, scanned the hall. "We are here," he declared in sonorous German, "to lay the foundation stone of the house which is to shelter the Jewish nation." The words hung in the air like a summons from history itself. Some wept openly, others sat rigid, daring to believe. At that moment, Herzl was not merely a man but a vessel for 2,000 years of longing. The delegates could almost feel the presence of generations. Past fathers and mothers who had lit Sabbath candles in secret under Inquisition Spain, who had trudged through the snows of Russia clutching Torah scrolls, who had whispered the phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem at Passover tables from Baghdad to Berlin." In Basel, the dream of return shifted from prayer to politics, from a messianic hope to a concrete plan. The birth of a vision. Herzl, and the first Zionist Congress, Herzl was an unlikely prophet. A worldly journalist from Vienna, more at home in the cafes of the Ringstrasse than in a synagogue, he had once believed that emancipation and assimilation would dissolve the Jewish problem. But the 1894 Dreyfus Affair in Paris, where an innocent Jewish officer was paraded in disgrace while mobs screamed death to the Jews, had seared him. France, the cradle of liberty and revolution, had shown him that even the most enlightened societies could not extinguish anti-Semitism. In his pamphlet Der Judenstaat, The Jewish State, published in 1896, Herzl argued with clarity and urgency. The Jews were not simply a religious minority but a nation bound by history and destiny, and as a nation, they required a homeland. It was not sentimentality, but necessity. The answer was political Zionism, organized, modern, and relentless. The Basel Congress of 1897 crystallized that vision. Nearly 200 delegates convened under Herzl's leadership. Drafting the Basel Program, Zionism seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured under public law. Too many the words seemed audacious, even impossible. Yet Herzl, with his orators' fire and journalists' gift for spectacle, understood that a seed planted in the imagination could one day grow into a state. Later in his diary, he wrote a line that has become prophetic. "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it." The waves of Aliyah. The dream would not remain in European Congress halls. It would take form in footsteps, in calloused hands, in plows cutting into stubborn soil. First Aliyah, 1882 to 1903. Even before Herzl, groups of Jews driven by pogroms in Russia and poverty in Eastern Europe had begun arriving in Ottoman Palestine. They came in trickles, known collectively as the First Aliyah. Families from villages in Ukraine and Romania sold what little they had and boarded ships bound for Jaffa. The port, reeking of salt and sweat, greeted them not with grandeur, but with chaos donkeys braying, stevedores shouting in Arabic and Greek. They purchased land, often at great cost, from absentee landlords in Beirut and Damascus, and set about draining malarial swamps and coaxing wheat from rocky fields. The settlements they founded, Pita, Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Zikron Yaakov, were fragile. Plagued by disease and Arab raids, many settlers despaired and returned to Europe, yet others persevered, sustained by donations from the French philanthropist Baron Edmond de Rothschild, who became the unlikely patron of this pioneering dream. Second, Aliyah 1904 to 1914. If the first Aliyah was a hesitant experiment, the second was a revolution. Sparked by renewed pogroms in Russia and the disillusionment of young radicals after the failed 1905 revolution, thousands of idealistic youths made their way to Palestine. They were not simply escaping persecution, they were coming to build a new society. They spoke of Aliyah not merely as immigration, but as a senta returned both spiritual and physical. Clad in rough work clothes, they rejected dependence on philanthropy and insisted on avoda ivrit Hebrew labor. They built the first kibbutzim collective farms where property and profits were shared, and where men and women labored side by side. The air of Galilee rang with hammer blows and Hebrew songs and chantant words reborn on young lips. Among them was David Ben-Gurion, a short, intense man with unruly hair, who arrived from Poland in 1906. He would one day become Israel's first prime minister. But in those early years, he hoed fields, taught Hebrew, and absorbed the ethos of pioneering sacrifice. Later waves, the Third Aliyah, followed World War I. When the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and Britain's conquest of Palestine seemed to promise official recognition. The fourth and fifth waves in the 1920s and 1930s brought middle-class Jews from Poland and professionals fleeing Nazi Germany. Each wave carried its own character: peasants, socialists, bourgeois families. Refugees, but together, they transformed the demography and landscape of Palestine. Tensions with the Arab population, yet the land was not empty. Palestine, under Ottoman rule and later the British Mandate, was home to an Arab population, Muslim and Christian, who tilled its fields, prayed in its mosques and churches, and traced their own roots to centuries past. At first, relations were wary, but not hostile. Jewish settlers bought land legally, often from absentee landlords, and many Arabs welcomed the economic activity: railways, orange groves, new markets. But as Jewish immigration grew and the Zionist aim of establishing a homeland became clear, fear deepened. To the Arab fella, watching newcomers drain his swamp and fence off once shared pastures, it seemed less an ascent than an encroachment. Clashes began: sporadically stone-throwing in Jaffa, disputes over wages, skirmishes between guards and villagers. By 1920, they erupted into riots. A Palestinian Arab leadership, alarmed by both Zionist ambitions and British support for them, organized protests and strikes. The seeds of a bitter conflict had been sown to peoples, both laying claim to the same soil, both armed with history and memory. Zionism was not a single monolith, but a tapestry of ideas. Herzl's political Zionism sought international recognition and diplomacy. Labor Zionists, inspired by socialist ideals, envisioned a just society forged by sweat and solidarity. Religious Zionists saw settlement as a fulfillment of divine promise. Revisionists under Ziv Jabotinsky, more militant, argued for a strong defense and territorial maximalism. What united them was a recognition that Jewish life in Europe was precarious and that assimilation could not guarantee safety. Zionism was, at once, an answer to centuries of persecution and an audacious gamble on the future. The tension with the Arabs of Palestine was not an accidental byproduct, but an inherent contradiction. A national movement seeking to establish itself in a land already inhabited. The Zionist dream of a land without a people, for a people without a land, collided with the lived reality of Palestinian Arabs, whose sense of dispossession would harden into resistance. Or the Jews, each pogrom in Russia, each discriminatory law in Poland, and finally the looming shadow of Nazism reinforced the urgency: if not Palestine, where? For the Arabs, each new ship docking in Jaffa carried a reminder that their homeland might slip away. When Herzl left Basel in 1897, he returned to Vienna, a man both celebrated and ridiculed. The European press dismissed his Congress as a fantasy. Yet within 50 years, as he had predicted, a Jewish state would indeed rise. Theodor Herzl would not live to see it. He died in 1904, worn down at just 44. But his vision, kindled in that crowded hall in Basel, became the axis around which Jewish history would turn. The Zionist movement was not born in triumph, but in longing, labor, and conflict. It was the story of a people reaching back to an ancient past while straining toward an uncertain future. And it was the story of a landed soil tilled by many hands, its hills echoing with competing prayers, where dreams of redemption and fears of loss intertwined. As the 20th century advanced, those tensions would deepen into open confrontation, shaping the destiny not only of Jews and Arabs, but of the entire modern Middle East.